Good afternoon. I feel extremely glad to welcome everyone to this webinar. Honorable Chairperson for KCHR, Professor Ken Ganesh, Honorable Director, Professor Dinesh Vadakini, respected Speaker, Dr. Digvijay Singh, distinguished scholars, and my dear colleagues. Today, we have a wonderful academic session by Dr. Digvijay Singh on the topic Narrating the Coast, Reimagining the Region, Indian Ocean and Malabar. Dr. Digvijay Singh teaches at the Department of History, Cotton University, Guwahati. He finished his PhD on the maritime history of early medieval Malabar from the Center for Historical Studies, JNU. His interests lie in the economic history of pre-modern South and Southeast Asia, with a particular focus on the circulation of commodities and networks and methods of transactions across the Indian Ocean. He has published articles on the history of the Indian Ocean and Malabar and has also co-edited a volume, Social Worlds of Pre-Modern Transactions, Perspectives from Indian Epigraphy and History. After the completion of the event, I'm sure that you all will feel enriched with knowledge on this particular topic. For the easy functioning of the event, the audience are requested to kindly keep their microphones on mute during the session. After the session, we will have a question answer session. You can type the questions on the chat box. For those who have concerns on typing, you can use raise hand option. You can ask the questions directly. And for the benefit of the speaker, the questions on the chat box will be read by us. And once again, I feel honored to welcome you all, welcome all for this webinar. I invite Professor Ken Ganesh to take over the session. Thank you.
Dr. Digvijay Singh, I think you can start the proceeding. I think you require about 45 minutes.
That will be suffice, sir.
Okay. Then we'll take it within 45 minutes and we'll have the question answer session.
Sure.
Okay. Say please.
Okay. Thank you. First of all, good afternoon, everyone, and big thank you to KCHR. I'm so glad that Professor Ganesh is present himself in this webinar. And he has actually been one of those mentors of my intellectual journey ever since I've started working on the maritime history of Malabar many years ago. And he was one of the first person that I got in touch with when I was an MPhil student long time back in JNU. And all the other scholars and students and colleagues who are present in this webinar. Good afternoon to all of you. What I'm going to share with you today, a lot of these ideas have actually evolved over the period of last decade and a half. When I started actually systematically looking at the history of the Indian Ocean, particularly focusing on the Malabar coast. And some of these ideas were presented in terms of findings in my PhD work. But my PhD work was largely looking at the Indian Ocean and the Malabar coast, strictly from the categories of commodities, communities, and the coast. I have decided for today's talk to move slightly away from those categories of analysis and have, as you can understand from the title of my lecture, and those of you who might have read the abstract, that I am going to be talking today, or rather posing certain questions which could be understood as methodological questions, that how do we go about looking at the history of any coastal region vis-a-vis the ocean, and how oceans and seas can actually form as a category of historical analysis. And if we look at them as category of historical analysis, then what sort of ramification or consequences would that sort of a consideration have on looking at what could be characterized as the regional history, or a history of a region, or a history of a formation of a region? So these are uh, some of the issues about which I'll be sort of talking to you today. These are the ideas. These ideas that I'm going to sharing with you are more in the form of a questions, because I don't have definite answers to the questions that I'm going to be posing in front of you today. But I'm hoping that these questions would sort of invite questions and thinking, and possibly also ways of answering those questions. So I'm looking forward to a response on your part as well. Let me share the slide with you. So as you can see here, I think, yeah, the slide is well. The topic of today's talk is narrating the coast and reimagining the region, Indian Ocean and Malabar. Now, two basic issues that I'm going to be exploring today in the talk are following. One, how to understand the impact of ocean over the historical processes of a region or a geographical area, landmass, which has an extended coastal line. And in particular, I'm going to be sort of applying this question to the case of Indian Ocean and Malabar during the 8th to 15th centuries. And related to the first question is the second question, which I'll be sort of talking to you about, sharing my views about, and expecting your responses on those comments in the form of the comments, questions, and suggestion. Is this that that is the question of the regional formation, including the state formation in Kerala, and how to develop a framework of understanding the transition in a society which is witnessing a regional state formation at a specific point of time in its historical trajectory, particularly understanding the impact of the coast and the coastal processes on this on the formation of a region or a regional identity, or a state in regional state society. So about the first question, which is a more historiographical, we'll have to, that is, to how to look at the impact of the ocean on the history of a region which has extended coastal line. If we look at the historiographical attempts to, early historiographical attempts to write about the history, ocean in history, you will find that these attempts were deeply rooted to the context of mercantilist commerce and colonial expansion. And the books, I mean, the very titles of the books that were written in the 18th century and the early 19th century can actually tell us about the framework within which they were looking at the oceans. For example, the book by A.T. Mahan, Influence of Sea Power Upon History, or for example, of K.M. Sardar Panikkar, India and the Indian Ocean, an essay on the influence of the sea power on Indian history, or for that matter, very early publication in 1912 of Radha Kumud Mukherjee, Indian Shipping. Now, one of the common feature of all these writings, though they are obviously talking about different periods, different oceans, and in different coastal societies, is this, that they were looking at oceans primarily through the prism of mercantilist trade, or through as a medium of colonial expansion. And even after the end of the era of mercantilist trade and disintegration of the colonial empires, certain remnants of this type of historiography continue to remain in vogue. And if we, for example, look at the history of the Indian Ocean, we will find that that the period between 1500 to 1800 gets reflected, gets sort of more importance. A large number of the volumes, books, articles, journals are actually on this period of history, compared to, for example, pre-1500 situation in the Indian Ocean with regard to the western seaboard of India, or for that matter, eastern seaboard of India. a very characteristic example of this attitude among the historians would be in the writings in an essay that was written in 1987 by Dennis Lombard and Genevieve Buchan. They were writing in the volume India and the Indian Ocean, edited by M.N. Pearson and Ashin Das Gupta. And they had written that, and they were basically taking an overview of the 15th century period in the Indian Ocean with regard to India. And they argued that writing the history of Indian Ocean is a daunting task in the 15th century. And before that, that is the before 15th century, they argued that it is nearly impossible to write a comprehensive history of India and the Indian Ocean in the period before 1400. And at the most, one can have a what they call very sketchy view of things as they are happening before the 14th century. Now, I'm not trying to suggest here that this kind of an attitude is just a result of methodological or ideological bias on the part of these historians who are writing about Indian Ocean. But the relative absence of sources like that of the European company records, which gives us, quantitative data and administrative data, is definitely a factor, that you don't have that kind of company records which can give you quantitative and administrative data for the centuries prior to the 15th century. But however, this one can also not deny this fact that we don't see any serious attempt on the part of these historians who are writing in the 60s and 70s and 80s to systematically explore the sources of the previous centuries. As a result of which, what we see that the corpus of Arabic and Persian treatises, including geographical treatises or travel literature, etc., has largely been not explored from the point of view of understanding the Indian Ocean maritime history. And maritime archaeology, for example, was something that was completely left out of the purview of these writings that were taking place in the 1970s and 80s. So what I want to say is that it was the unavailability of the sources were not the only reason why histories of the pre-1500 Indian Ocean were not written. And as M.N. Pearson writes in his Indian Ocean, the publication that came out in 2003, one of the attitudes that was visible in the writings that were taking place on Indian Ocean in the 1970s and 80s for the period before, the period before the 1500, is this, that they simply thought that Indian Ocean became the subject of or an arena of historical action only after the intervention of the European companies. So what came before that was of no significance for these historians. Hence, there was no real attempt to look for sources or to historicize this period. With very few exceptions like J.F. Horani's Arab seafaring in the Indian Ocean in the ancient and early medieval time, which tried to address this historiographical bias in the writing of the Indian Ocean. We don't have many other writings which are giving importance to the Indian Ocean in the pre-1500 period. Now, subsequently, Ashin Das Gupta, K.N. Chaudhary, M.N. Pearson, K.S. Mathew, many historians wrote about India and the Indian Ocean. And some of these writings also tried to look at the period before 1500. And one of the common feature of all these writings was this, that they were very strongly influenced by the classic work of Fernand Braudel on the history of the Mediterranean, the famous Mediterranean and the Mediterranean world in the age of Philip II, that came up in 1972. So Ashin Das Gupta, M.N. Pearson, and more directly K.N. Chaudhary, influenced by the ideas of Fernand Braudel, tried to write the history of the Indian Ocean. And in these writings, one of the things that informed these writings is this, that they worked to develop a narrative of the Indian Ocean, which would emerge as a space which has a historical unity. And that is something that Ferdinand Braudel has done in the case of the Mediterranean. And he says the Mediterranean world has a sort of a fundamental unity which can be seen in terms of the structures that were formed in the longue durée. So Dasgupta, Pearson, K.N. Chaudhary, etc., also made an attempt to look at the Indian Ocean as a unified historical subject. And in this process, two things that they focused particularly, or two or three things that they focused particularly. One was obviously long distance maritime trade. Second was merchants community, and third was port. Now these three categories, that is the merchant communities, port, and long distance trade, maritime trade, they became the main historical categories through which history of the Western Indian Ocean was written, as well as how the question of the impact of the developments on the Indian Ocean to the Western seaboard of India or Eastern seaboard of India came to be historicized and came to be analyzed. Now, there is no doubt that long distance maritime trade was obviously one of the most important factor that sort of linked the different regions of the Indian Ocean world into the connected circuit of exchange and trade. And the travel of the people from different coastal regions of the Indian Ocean was largely facilitated through these extended network of maritime trade. But the singular focus on the trade, I believe, created a particular kind of an historiography whereby impact of the ocean or on the historical processes of the coastal region came to be confined to the geographical locations which were the sites of the trade, that is the port. As a result of which port, or as K.N. Chaudhary calls emporia towns, they became the only sort of geographical regions which got focused in these writings. And that of course, these kind of writings led to, illuminating results with regard to the history of the port towns. For example, the classical study of Ashin Dasgupta on the port of Surat, and various other such writings about the mercantile communities. But it created its own problem in a sense that for the overall theorization of transitions that are taking place in any coastal region, sea or the influence of the ocean was only relegated to the domain of trade. So when the changes or large scale changes came to be seen in any particular historical region, for example Malabar, in a particular time, then the discussion of the Indian Ocean was only with respect to the trade or the urban economy or the port town. And this, I argue, created a methodological problem whereby scholars could not sufficiently look at the overall impact of ocean proximity of the region such as Malabar to the sea in its historical evolution. Rather, the role of the ocean or the maritime influences got confined to the discussion about trade only. And this partly was a result of, as I told you, of the particular way in which the history of the India and the Indian Ocean was done by these historians like Asin Dasgupta, K.N. Chaudhary, M.N. Pearson, etc., who were influenced by the Braudelian framework. Now, one of the strong theoretical critique of the Braudelian framework came up in terms of the publication of a book in 2000 by Harden and Purcell. And that book, called The Corrupting Sea, changed, or rather questioned some of these assumptions about the Mediterranean history, and implication of these questions obviously were also there for understanding the history of the other oceans, like Indian Ocean and that of the coastal regions. Now, one of the things that Hardin and Purcell did is that they argued that, that they said that Brodelian framework give emphasis on material structures. For example, trade or transactions of commodity, which is also obviously reflected in the writings of scholars like Asindas Gupta, Ken Chaudhary, etc. And it did not sufficiently looked at the questions of what they call the mental frameworks, attitudes, beliefs, which also is an important part of Mediterranean history. This study influenced generation of scholars, including, for example, Pearson, who acknowledges the influence of this work in his 2003 book, Indian Ocean. And he says that, and then he argues and he changes his position on several issues. And he says that history of the ocean is not just about trade and worship. This is what M.N. Pearson writes in the introduction of his 2003 publication, Indian Ocean. And he says that history of the ocean is not just about trade and worship. And what is needed is the description of material and the mental framework, the psychological as well as the geographical. And he argues that in order to understand the impact of the sea on the land and the vice versa, one should not simply focus on the development on the sea in terms of warfare or trade, but rather one should try to see what he again borrows from Hardin and Purcell, what he calls history in the sea and history of the sea, or rather history of the ocean and history in the ocean. And what is this history of the ocean and history in the ocean that Hardin Purcell talks about and M.N. Pearson applies in the context of the Indian Ocean? He says that the first exercise, that is the history of the ocean, concentrates on the connections and the processes within its boundaries, that is within the boundaries, physical boundaries of an ocean or geographical boundary of a landmass or a coastal region. And secondly, that is the second, that history in the ocean, he says, goes beyond activities in the physical limits of the ocean and relates the ocean with the larger history of a geographical area and specifically, and world history generally. Now, this history or this kind of approach towards the history of the ocean, that is history in the ocean and history of the ocean, treats the seaborne trade as one, obviously treats seaborne trade as one major facet of maritime history, but not the sole thrust of the maritime history. And it believes that maritime history addresses the questions of attitudes and orientation of a given society and polity towards its relevant maritime space and takes a closer look at those whose life dependent on the sea, which is not just the merchants, but sailors, seamen, ship captains, rulers, shipbuilders, and also pirates, and various other communities. Now, if we choose to apply these insights of what Hardin Purcell has done in the case of the Mediterranean and what M.N. Pearson says should be applied in the context of the history of the Indian Ocean, specifically to the question of the Indian Ocean and Malabar in the period between 800 to 1500, then what are going to be the changes in our approach to look at the influence of the sea on the coast? That is the influence of Indian Ocean on the history of the Malabar. Perceptions of the ocean as well as that of the coast is one of the things that Hardin and Purcell considers very important in terms of understanding the impact of the ocean on the coast, that how communities which are dependent on the sea for their sustenance and survival look at the sea and vice versa, how the people who are traveling across the sea or who are deriving this, or rather people of the sea, look at the coast. Now, and so I'm going to focus now on the perception of the coastal, applying these insights, I'm now going to focus on what is the kind of perception of the coastal topography that is emerging off the Malabar coast from the contemporary sources of the time, sources of 9th century, 10th century, 11th century, 12th century, 13th, 14th century. Now, before I move on to sort of look at or understand the pattern of the perception of the coastal topography that is emerging from the sources, let me very briefly, sort of also talk to you about what are the kind of sources that we are talking about. Primarily, I'm talking about the Arabic geographical treatises, such as that of the Ibn Hawkal, Ibn Khurdabdeh, or for example, Al-Idrisi, Al-Masudi. This is one sort of a genre of the text that I'll be looking at to understand what is the perception of the coastal landscape of Malabar in the writings of these geographers, Arabic geographers. Secondly, of course, the Rihla of Ibn Battuta, the travel accounts of the people who are actually visiting the Malabar coast, Ibn Battuta's or Marco Polo's account. And thirdly, also the Geniza letters, the letters of the Jewish traders who were active in this Red Sea, Aden, and Malabar trade network. And this is one category of the source which has become very prominent in the recent times in terms of understanding the Indian Ocean history as well as history of Malabar and the impact of the Indian Ocean on the history of the Malabar, because these are the letters which give a lot of vital sort of direct historical information about the maritime world of the Indian Ocean, particularly telling us about the ports of Malabar. So let us talk about or look at the perception of the coastal topography that is emerging from these types of sources. Now, you will see that in this map that these are some of the sites which are dotted on the Google map, which are the port sites, identified port sites, which are discussed in range of these textual sources, as well as Geniza letters, as well as the Chinese sources. I have not talked about the Chinese sources. We also have Chinese sources of the 13th and the 14th century, which talk about many of these coastal sites. Now, these are the coastal sites which are identified coastal sites. In the accounts of Al-Idrisi or, for example, Ibn Khurdab, there are names of many other port sites of the coast of Malabar, which we have not very securely managed to identify or locate. And as a result, those sites are not listed here, but there are many more coastal sites. And why? The reason I am talking about the presence of many coastal sites in the description of Malabar coast in the writings of the Arab geographers or the travelers such as the Ibn Battuta is because it has a ramification for us to understand the what I call the perceptions of the coastal topography. Now, you can see right from the various writers and these geographers look at the coast of Malabar, which is presented variously as Malabar, Minibar, Milibar, Mulabar, etc., in sources, starting from Sindhbor, Goa. Some of the scholars would say that it starts from, some of the geographers would say that the Malabar would start from Goa. Some would say that it will start from Faknur. Some others would say that it will start from Mount Hilly or Mount Delhi, which is identified as Marai. And then, of course, Pantalyani Kollam, Calicut, Kodungalur, Kochi, Kollam, and various of these ports occur in these Arabic geographical treatises, as well as Chinese text, as well as the Geniza sources. Now, if we look at the description, for example, of these port sites, for example, Manjarur or Valarapattanam or Pantalyali Kollam or Kaulam or Kulam, then we'll find that many of these port sites would be discussed by Ibn Khurdabdeh or Ibn Battuta or Al-Idrisi with minutest of details. For example, Valarapattanam, also known as Buddhapattana in Arabic sources, which is identified with the town Valarapattanam, uh, which was an area in the near vicinity of Kannanur, and which was also is an area which is associated with the uh, a dynasty called Mushika dynasty, and it was considered as an important center, important port town of the Mushikas, as we know from the Mushika Vamshakavya. Now, all these records would give detailed description about what is the kind of what are the kind of structure that they encounter at this site of Valarapattanam or Buddhapattannam. It would say that, that this town, for example, Ali Idrisi would say that this town was has the fortification and with lofty towers and deep moats. And it is chosen as the place of residence by the kings of Kerala. And it was also in they would say that would also give the distance between Valarapattanam and that of the Ballin, another coastal site that is prominent in the accounts of Ibn Khordadbeh, but we have not managed to sort of identify it securely. And similarly, it would also tell us an information that earliest Ibn Battuta, for example, would tell us the heavy, strong presence of Muslims and Muslim Arab merchants in this town of the Valarapattanam, and how the distance, and Ibn Battuta would tell us that the ruler of this town was one Kublai. And we have not managed to identify who this Kublai is, but he says that Kublai is one of the most very powerful rulers of the Malabar, that is Malabar region. And I mean, I'm just giving you some sort of information that is available in this account. They are very rich in terms of describing these port sites. I mean, and same is the case with various other port sites that you can see on the map, whether it is, for example, Fandarena or Pantalyali Kollam, which is situated north of Calicut. Even this is presented in both Arabic accounts as well as Geniza records, as well as the Chinese sources, as a very important port town. And it is said that Fandarena is situated, for example, 4 marhalas. The distance between the Fandarena and that of the Kulam is also given in terms of the this unit, which Arab geographers use to give distance, which is Majra and Marhala. So a very minute kind of a detailing is given. What is the landscape like? What is the distance between this port to the next port of Malabar? Who are the rulers like? What are the kind of people who are settled at this port site? And of course, naturally, the description would be rich in terms of spices, that what sort of pepper and other spices are available as an item which could be procured from this particular port sites. Chinese sources of the 14th century would also, for example, talk about the Pantalyali Kollam and point out that Pantalyali Kollam provided an excellent sort of anchorage facility for the horse ships. And often the horse ship in the days of the intense monsoon would come to the port of the Pantalyali Kollam. And this is one place where Chinese ships would also frequently visit. So, I mean, I can go on and on to talk about how these port sites, such as that of the Manjarur or Valarapattanam or Pantalyali Kollam, etc., are described in the variety of different kinds of sources of 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th century. Geniza letter, for example, would say that that's this place, Pantalyali Kollam, is mentioned as Fandarina in the Geniza record, and it is mentioned that this is one of the port sites from where you will have, in the Geniza letters, ships of different Nakhudas are undertaking their journey from the site of the Pantalyali Kollam. Same sort of a description you will also find, for example, with regard to the port of Kaulam, or which is Kollam or Quilon, which again figures very prominently in the Geniza records, but also in the accounts of Arabic geographers, Ibn Battuta, etc., etc. Now, the this rich description that we see of the coast of these port towns, and I have not talked about. I mean, I can talk about Jiribattan, Kozhikode, Cochin, etc., etc. They are also mentioned in many of these textual sources. But the point that a larger point that I want to make is that the description of these port towns and multiple port towns that we get from the sources of this period has a particular pattern, and that pattern is that that these port towns are described, or the port sites and the port towns are described with extreme sort of a very detailed description of these port sites, and while one obviously have to accept that many of these Arabic geographers, whether Haukal or Khurdabde or Masudi or Idrisi, never actually traveled to the port towns of the Malabar about which they are talking or writing, but their description seemed to be fairly accurate representation of the coastal landscape of Malabar as well as of these port towns, because we find the information that they give often is corroborated by either Geniza letter or indigenous sources, or, for example, account of Ibn Battuta, or through the epigraphic records. So this leads one, this can be interpreted in a way that even though they have not really visited the port towns of the Malabar, they have a fairly accurate idea of these port towns. And the reason why they had a fairly good idea of the port towns of the Malabar is simply the intensity and the dynamism of the link that linkage that the Malabar had with the other regions of the Western Indian Ocean, and the frequency of the travel. So these geographers obviously are taking the information from the merchants and the traders and the preachers and the traveler and the seamen, sailors, etc. The frequency of the travel of these people, who are people who Hurd Purcell call people of the sea, is so much that these geographers who are located in different cities, inland cities, they have a fairly good idea about the coastal regions of coastal Malabar as well as the port towns of the Malabar. Another issue that is striking is the minute detailing of these port towns, that which port town would come after which port town, how many days it would take from this port town to reach to another port town, distance between port towns in terms of Majra and Marhala, description about the river around the port towns and mountains and etc., flora, fauna, in these contemporary sources requires explanation. And one of the ways in which I look at this very detailed description of the port and the Malabar coast in these accounts is this, that Malabar appeared to them, or the ports of Malabar and Malabar coast in general appeared to them as a distinct coastal region. Distinct coastal region which they know with a considerable degree of detail and specificity. That is why very specific description of the port towns of the Malabar. And this becomes, this point becomes even more clear if we look at the description of the other seaboard of the Indian subcontinent, that is Coromandel coast. Coromandel coast, in the writings of these geographers, travelers, appears to be extremely fuzzy, and there's a general term Mabar that is used to refer to the entire coastal region, with not much detailed discussion about the port towns within that coast, which is referred to as Mabar. So if you compare the description of the Malabar and Mabar in these writings, then Malabar is presented with minute details and specificity, while there is a fuzziness, there is a degree of fuzziness with regard to presenting the eastern seaboard of India. And one of the ways in which it could be explained, one of the ways in which I have tended to explain this very specific and detailed perception of the coastal region in the contemporary writings, perception of the Malabar as a coastal region in the contemporary writings, is to look at the role of coastal polities in this process. That if there is a distinct image of the port and the coast that is emerging in this period, or the perception of distinctness of this coast that is emerging in this period, then what is the reason behind this perception, or what could be some of the reasons behind this distinctness, which is shaping up this distinctness? And one of the reasons why which I think was behind shaping of this regional distinctiveness is the role of the coastal polities. And that is why you will see in the discussion about the ports, towns of the Malabar coast, you will have Ibn Battuta or Al-Idrisi, or for that matter, some of the Ganiza letters would be talking about the rulers with respect to the ports, in the political authority with respect to the ports. So ports are described in detail, along with the description that this port falls under so-and-so ruler, so-and-so is the ruler of this port. While description of the eastern seaboard of India, you will have, the eastern seaboard of India would generally be described as Mabar, with one ruler as the ruler of the Mabar, rather than multiple ruling authorities who would be sort of who would be discussed and mentioned in the contemporary records. Now, this pattern of the role that possibly the coastal polities were playing in giving this distinctive perception of coastal region, that is of Malabar, to the contemporary writers, travelers, traders, is also being supported by the findings of writings of Elizabeth Lambourne and also recently Sebastian Prange. Now, Elizabeth Lambourne, in her studies of the Khutbah network, argues that Khutbah, basically she argues, she has studied the patronage that was given by the Rasulid sultans to the qadis and khatibs of the larger Western Indian Ocean world, including, for example, people who are based in the western seaboard of India, Gujarat, Konkan, Malabar, etc. And she writes that almost 43 individuals, 40-odd individuals are mentioned as the recipients of these donations. As per the court records of the Rasulid Sultans of Yemen, they received annual stipends so that they could read khutbah in the name of the Rasulid Sultan. And out of these 48, out of these 60-odd people, some of them, they are mentioned by the names of the port towns. So the listing of these people who are qadis and khatibs who are recipient of these stipends from the Rasulid Sultans of Yemen is listed in the court chronicles, and the listing is done in a particular way. And what is the way? The pattern is that generally the mention of the person who is a recipient of a stipend would be with regard to a port town, and port town would be mentioned with regard to a particular region. So, for example, if the recipient, or Qadi or a Khatib, is the recipient of the stipend in the port of the Kanabaya or Cambay in Gujarat, then it would be under the heading Cambay and the region called Bilal al-Jazurat, which is Gujarat, and then the person who is the recipient of the stipend. So this is how it is done. Now, it has exception in the case of the Malabar. In the case of the Malabar, when the recipient, the places are mentioned, but generally the ruler or the region is sort of not explicitly mentioned, but rather people are mentioned separately with regard to the port towns and not under a broader port town. So you have almost 9 port towns like Ponnani, Kannanur, Fandarina, etc., as mentioned as the places where people have been recipients of the stipend from the Rasulid Sultan. But these people and the port towns are individually mentioned, not mentioned as a part of a region or, for example, as a part of any one principal port town. And the reason for this omission of heading, while describing about the recipients of these stipend from the Rasulid Sultan, Elizabeth Lambourne has an interesting suggestion. She says that this is probably, the omission is probably is a reflection of a quantitative change in the network along the coast, Malabar coast, where each port maintained its own links with Aden, rather than channeling them through a central authority. Now, if we accept this contention and the pattern that we see in the khutbah, in the grant of the stipend to the qadis and khatibs by the Rasulid Sultan, then we see that that there is definitely the perception of the polity, or the political perception of the coast of Malabar has something to do with the way in which the polity is organized in this region. And this will bring us to the second question that I said that I will be focusing on today. That is, how do we look at the evolution of the of Kerala as a region and the political processes that were considered to be a definitive hallmark, that is the rise of the regional state in the form of the chair, as a definitive hallmark of the growth of a regional identity in Kerala from the 9th century onwards. Now, to address this question, the framework that we have in the writings of scholars such as Keshwan Veluthat or M.G.S. Narayanan, that they see that the articulation of the regional identity of the Kerala, which emerges in the several of the textual sources dated to the 8th century, 9th century, terms such as Keraleshu or Keraladhipati or Kerala Nath. These terms are occurring from the 8th, 9th century onwards. And she says that, and the Keshwan Veluthat particularly argues that the articulation of the regional identity was the most hallmark feature of this articulation of the regional identity was the emergence of a regional state in the form of the Chera polity of Mahodayapuram, with its sovereignty extending over the large parts of the region. In other words, the multiple changes that were taking place when the historical transition in this region is happening was reflected through these political processes, which is the rise of the regional state, firstly in the form of the Cheras of the Mahodayapuram. Now, we know very well through the excellent studies by MGS and Narayanan and others that rise of the Chera polity has been explained through the process of Brahmana migration to the region, and how that led to the agrarian expansion and how that paved the way for the emergence of the regional state order. And it is argued that the slow and the silent process of Brahmana migration, and I'm actually quoting, from the north caused the differentiation in the language and the culture of the region from the culture of the region from the rest of the Tamilkam, of which it was part since the early historic period. Now, one of the sources which was used to make this kind of an argument of presence of a strong Brahminical presence in the early medieval state in Kerala is the information that is available in Keralolpatti. Keralolpatti as a text has been subject to historical inquiry from various points of view, from the approach of looking at it as an actual history to that of looking at it as completely devoid of any historical significance. Keshwan Veluthat, in one of his articles, have argued that we should look at Keralolpatti as a form in which Kerala society expressed its historical consciousness of the past events. Now, if we accept this contention that Keralolpatti contained the historical consciousness of the Kerala as a region, as it was witnessing the transition of a regional society and regional state system, then some of the conclusions are in order. For example, let us look at the sort of a question of, let us look at two portions, particularly of the Keralolpatti, which is of significance for us here at this moment. One is the description of the creation of the territory of Kerala, and the second is the end of the Perumal regime, the description about the events that led to the end of the Perumal regime. We all know that the Keralpatti begins with the narrative of the creation of the Kerala by Parasuram, and it says that he claims the land between Gokarn and Kanyakumari and gave it to the Brahmanas to rule, and subsequently, the story further on goes on and explain how Kshatriya and Brahmashatra, etc., kind of a transition was seen in this region. Now we obviously agree with M.G.S. Narayanan and Keshavan Veluthart that this feature of the Perumal, this feature of the Parasuram legend, that Parasuram lifted the land from the Gokarn to Kanyakumari and created Kerala, should not be seen as either a reflection of an actual geographical phenomena, or, for example, this was not even a narrative which was specific to the Kerala, but rather it was something that has genesis of this narrative was actually rooted in Konkan and southern Kannada region, which the studies by Christopher Vale or Pradeep Kumar Chaudhary have also highlighted. But the specific role that in this myth, the specific role of ocean in the creation of the coastal landscape, be it Konkan or, for example, Malabar, Kerala, deserves our attention. Because if we accept, as Keshavan Veluthart very convincingly argues, that Keralolpatti contains a form of historical consciousness specific to the Kerala society, and as it records and presents and uses the notion of past which suited specifically to its own historical emergence as a region and legitimize the form of polity that is emerging here in the early medieval period, having a strong Brahminical influence, then the second question that would emerge is, then how are we going to understand the proximity of the region to the Indian Ocean shaping its historical consciousness? Because, I mean, in this narrative, if we accept that this narrative that the Brahminical influence was the main sort of a main force which legitimized political power in the rising state society in the early medieval Kerala, which is supported by this myth of origin that is there in the Keralolpatti, then how are we going to understand this part of myth where Kerala is considered as being created, or any coastal society, for example, Konkan or Gujarat is being considered as created through the ocean by the efforts of this legendary figure that is the Parasuram. So how do we then understand the proximity of the region to the Indian Ocean shaping its historical consciousness? And while we think about answering this question, the second sort of a part of the narrative of the Keralolpatti, that is the section where it describes the end of the Chera rule, that how the last, I mean, it's well known that how last the Chera ruler converted to Islam and left for Makkah, and he died there. But before he went on to the pilgrimage to Makkah, he divided his kingdom among his friends and relatives. Now, the action on the part of the last Chera ruler is seen as a result of, I mean, in the Keralolpatti, it is interpreted that he was filled with remorse and guilt because he unduly have ruled and appropriated the territory, which is a Brahmana territory, because according to the Parshuram legend, Parshuram has given it to the Brahmanas. So he was filled with guilt, and as a result of which, in order to repent of the sin, he he thought that it is not possible to repent that sin within Brahmanism. Hence, he sort of converted and took on the journey to Makkah and died here, and distributed his sort of kingdom to the different, his relative sons and so on and so forth. The version of this narrative, which is presented in other texts of slightly later date, that is the 16th century, which is Tuhfatul Mujahideen. in that text, the story acquires a new dimension, whereby the role of the maritime trade, traders, oceanic travels, and pilgrimage across the ocean becomes the decisive factor. The decisive factor in terms of the change or the conversion of the chairman Perumal and his leaving the Malabar region for the Makkah. There, the role is the cause of this change is being given in terms of the role that is played by Jewish merchant, Christian merchant, Arab merchants, as well as the influence of Islam and the pilgrimage across the oceanic waters. So these are the factors. I mean, I'm not describing the story version that is there in the Tuhfatul Mujahideen, assuming that most of us here are familiar with that change in the slight change that we see in the Tuhfatul Mujahideen. But that narrative clearly sort of brings in the question of the influence of the sea in this entire development that is also narrated in the Keralul Patti, that is the end of the Chera rule. Now, after the end of the Chera rule, we know that the nature of the polity in the Malabar coast changes, and the Swarupam form of polity came into existence, and about which Professor Ken Ganesh has extensively written. So this Swarupam for all these successors of the Cheras, if one uses this word, that is the rulers that are ruling different Swarupams, ruling groups that are ruling different Swarupams, they all claim or refer to this story of last chairman ruler dividing his kingdom and going to Makkah and converting to Islam in order to claim power as well as legitimize their power. So this narrative has a considerable significance for the polities that came to exist on the Malabar region even after the collapse of the Cheras and continue to remain in operation for a couple of centuries to come, largely sort of feeling the benefiting from the port towns and trying to maintain a particular kind of a coastal hierarchy also among themselves, leading to conflict between the rulers of these different Sarupas and so on and so forth. That I am not going to discuss here right now. But the point that again emerges is that that how are then we going to look at again the question that I have posed, that in what way are we going to look at the role of the ocean or the traders, merchants in the practice of polity, or what P. Chattopadhyay called political processes in this region taking place between 8th, 9th century to 14th, 15th century, especially when we consider this particular kind of narratives, such as that of the Keralul Patti, as representing the historical consciousness of that society. Now, one way to look at, to answer this question, partially answer this question, obviously I'm expecting all of you to, contribute in this discussion to answer this question. One partial explanation could be to simply look at that how trade is beneficial for the ruling polities, and that is why there is a reciprocal relationship between the merchants and the rulers of the coastal regions of Malabar. And we all know about Jewish copper plate and Christian copper plate and the existence of maritime guilds and how the role that they played for the creation of Nagaram-like institutions in port towns like Kulam, that is the Quilon, etc. So that is one kind of a way of looking at influence of the ocean in understanding the development of polity in a particular region. But this is simply at the level of looking at what could be characterized as the material sort of foundations of the state society. And there also, if we consider the wealth that is generated through the trade as being very significant and crucial for the state formation, that itself would be a rewarding exercise, because so far the dominant theory that we have of the state formation largely actually in the early medieval Kerala largely actually derives from the pan-Indian framework that we have of a state formation, regional state formation in the early medieval centuries. That is the horizontal spread of the agrarian society, leading to the surplus production, leading to the social differentiation, etc., and paving the way for the emergence of regional order. So in that picture also, if the maritime wealth is considered as the material, one very strong material block for the emergence of the state society, that itself would be, I believe, a great step forward in terms of understanding the influence of the Indian Ocean on the history of the Malabar. But I'm simply wondering that can there be other ways in which also the influence of the sea in the domain of the perception, in the domain of the mental frameworks and attitude, in the domain of ideology to legitimize political power, can the influence of the sea be seen as constituting the formation of Malabar as a region in this period. So I'm going to stop here now because I have already taken around 55 minutes. And I would like you to sort of contribute to the discussion. If you have questions, please ask. And frankly speaking, I may not be in a position to give answers to a lot of your questions, but yes, I would request you to think with me about some of these questions in today's session, in today's webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Digvijay Kumar Singh.
I have not taken more than the required time.
Okay. You finished in correct with the correct time period.
Thank you.
And
Dr. Digvijay Kumar Singh,
Sir.
I am sorry that I may have to leave within about 10 minutes.
No problem, sir.
For some other purpose with the KCHR only.
Sure, sir. Sure.
But,
no problem.
So I'll just quickly make one or two comments and just stop there. And because there is always possibility that you have been work with the KCHR even earlier, so there is always possibility of our discussions later also.
Sure, sir. Sure.
I think one particular point which I am trying to make is that you see, despite all our respects to Professor MGS and Professor Keshavan Velutat, etc., you see, one need not stress too much on Kerala Ulpatti as the historical consciousness of Kerala society, etc. Because that is, I think, stretching a thing bit too far. I think that is, some of us really feel that, of course, it is important for the Brahmins and the Naduvadi Swarupams to develop such a narrative, and it's very important for them. And it was politically significant also in the medieval times. There is no doubt about it. But when we discuss it today regarding Kerala history, when you look back upon it as to say that it's historical consciousness of Kerala society, I think it is stretching a bit too far. That is one point, that brief point that I'm trying to make. Second thing is the point regarding your discussion about coastal polities are very interesting. And that is where, you see, I have to make one or two things which there has to be a, possibly this whole question of trade and trade states, which has been sort of, hoisted upon us by a number of historians. I mean, I'm sorry to say that. Number of historians, like Travancore being a third trade state and, Zamorin being another trade state, etc., etc. All these things create a lot of confusion there also. So I feel that there has to be a distinction being made, a very valid point which you're making, between the Arab traders who are looking at the coastal area and the explanations of the coastal area. As you correctly pointed out, either Al-Idrisi or Al-Qaswini or any of them never Al-Masudi, they never visited Malabar coast. Despite that, they were able to collect so much of information regarding the Malabar coast, is, I think, related to also to the trade and the nature of trade which they're handling. And that is, I think, very important because they were looking at products and the sources of their products. And the sources of the products means that you have to look at the hinterlands from where the products are coming from. And they have to negotiate with those merchants who are actually there in that particular hinterland, along with the trade, along with those people who are there, indigenous population also. So they required all kinds of information regarding the type of population, the type of hinterlands, as well as the details of the merchandise that is possible in order to actually conduct their trade. And also the money, which is very important because they were continuously doing money changing from one particular kind of money to the other. They were also doing bills of exchange of various kinds. So which means that all these things required considerable information base, and they were collecting that information base and acquiring it. Whereas in your Malabar Coromandel case, the problem seems that they were actually trading with the big traders, the Chettiar community and the other communities. So mostly it is outside they were not coming to the coast of the ports at all. They were often exchanging in the outside sea itself, and they were exchanging with them. So that created the difference between the two kinds, which I think, which you can check it up. I don't know whether it is correct or not. You can just think about it. Another thing regarding the whole question is the intermediate trading is the presence of Anjuvannam and Manikramam, the indigenous trade groups in South India, who were trading with all these kinds of people, including, as far as we know, they were also possibly trading with the Europeans. So this Anjuvannam and Manikramam is an interesting process which has not been fully studied except by Mira Abraham and a few others who have done their work. But apart from that, we are yet to find a very detailed, in-depth study by anybody regarding the question of the merchant trading groups in medieval Indian Ocean. I'm not talking about the Indian and other kinds of groups which were actually working with them. So there was also the exchange that is taking place, and we know that in Malabar coast, both Anjuvannam and Manikramam were operating already. During the early 8th century onwards, both Anjuvannam and Manikramam were operating, and also the Persian traders, including the Christian traders, along with the other traders, were also being designated as Anjuvannam and Manikramam. The Jewish were actually being designated here. The Christians were designated here, and possibly some of the Arabs also. There has to be discussion regarding that, which means that there is a kind of an indigenization of trade taking place, which allowed these kind of traders to operate very freely. I mean, despite all the difference, they were able to operate very freely with very little political barriers. I mean, I'm saying that political, of course, they were giving presents and prestations to all the coastal rulers and getting their favors, etc. There is a lot of evidence for that. But, the barriers are much less. But when you come down to the European traders, actually their trade was more political, directly. What we call as colonialism. So this political trading by the Europeans, monopolistic political trading by the Europeans, and the goods to goods exchange practices that were followed by the Arabs determine their, their knowledge as well as their possibilities of the local trading groups. And naturally, your point is correct regarding the coastal polities, because the indigenous trading groups are also linked with the coastal polities, and we know that a number of people were entitled and given various kinds of possessions by the the coastal polities, which meant that this trade, we are not. So that is why the whole question of the growth of Naduvadi Swarupams cannot be just limited to Brahminical origins alone, because, Brahminical origins, they obviously touted for the growth of the caste systems, the Chaturvarnya formations, the social formations, everything they touted. But in terms of actual, the resources under their command, they had to depend on Christians, they had to depend on Muslims, they had to depend on Arabs, a lot of other, even possibly the Chinese and various other Indonesians. We don't know much about Indonesians, but there are references to Indonesian ships that are coming here, which means that Indonesians might have come here. So all these things were very important for them as far as the mobilization resources were concerned. So ideologically Brahminical, but not necessarily on the basis of resources. That is the curious kind of position which all these Swarupams are involved. I think one has to look at it in that point of view. And that is where the coming of the Europeans actually broke this kind of, the kind of trade, one would call as trade balance, so to speak, which maintained these Swarupams were broken by the Europeans. Maybe that is one possibility. I'm sorry to listen to your response and then I will leave. I leave it to the academic coordinator to do
Sure.
the rest.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir, for first of all, for being here. Secondly, for these extensive comments that you've made. I would completely sort of agree with you, and you have actually given me a direction to think about, where you have said that if you want to look at the polities such as that of the Naduvalis, then one should look at maybe ideologically they are Brahminical, but in terms of their material foundations, it was more like influenced by the different kinds of traders. This is one of the things that I also have in mind, that that we can't that if you look at these political groups, then we can't simply keep the ocean out of the way in which they were coming up and exercising their power and authority. And even if generally the description that we have of is, again, the Brahminical influence paving the way for the state formation. But on the ground, we get so much of this information where we can't simply see that it is all Brahmanas in agrarian agriculture and agrarian taxation that is at the core of the emergence of these Naduvalis. So this is one probably direction in which I need to think about, that ideologically maybe Brahminical, and in certain senses only maybe Brahminical, even not completely ideologically also Brahminical. But in terms of the material foundations of these polities, the sea is important, the ocean is important. I also sort of agree with you with regard to what you call the trade states, that how trade state, this idea of trade state has created the problem in understanding some of the polities, including Zamori and Samudri kings. This I think is a problematic sort of a position that some of the historians have taken, particularly the historians who have tried to present or recently who have tried to present a view whereby they see that there was hardly any change with the coming of the Europeans in the Indian Ocean. And they tried to present that trade and polity was tied to each other in the Indian Ocean, including that of the Malabar coast, the way it was, for example, in the Mediterranean in the days of discovery. In other words, basically the attempt is to say that there was hardly any change. And mercantilist trade, or trade with a strong component of political influence or violence, in other words, political violence was always a nature of, always the way in which the things were happening in the Indian Ocean, which it was not. And you're rightly saying that earlier it was exchange, which was far more in terms of exchange of commodities through an intricate system of money, commodity exchange, goods also. And I've written about some of these issues in some of my articles, that how sometimes more than money, it was the complicated and high volume transactions of items in the Geniza letters are being done in terms of goods to good exchange. And good to good exchange should not be reduced to the simple understanding of barter, which is a very simple and trivial kind of a trade. So yes, this is a point that need to be actually pushed.
So thank you very much. I'll be leaving.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Professor Dineshan Vadakanil, do you want to make any comment?
Thank you very much, Farshia. But I'll keep my questions and comments for the time being. And there are, I think, some questions on the chat box. And there will be more questions coming up from the attendees side. So go on to that.
Okay. We have several questions by MR. I'll read them one by one. Why do we tend to overlook the Christian exchanges occurring in the Malabar region during this period? Could it be that Christian exchanges were as significant as Islamic ones, but were overshadowed or disrupted by the arrival of the Portuguese?
Okay. No, I mean, this I don't think is the, I mean, none of the serious works on the history of the Indian Ocean and Malabar would overlook the role of the Christian merchants. And there have been many writings by several scholars, including, for example, Pius Malek Andithil, who was also my teacher, K.S. Matthews. And I have also written articles on the Syrian Christians and particularly the role that they played in rotating the wheels of commerce, as well as establishing Nagaram-like institutions in some of the port towns, like, for example, Kochi. And they definitely played a very important role. And when we look at, say, this is the point that I was making in response to the question that Professor Ganesh also has raised, that when we look at the pre-modern commerce, it was a situation whereby interdenominational cooperation was pretty much a norm. Okay, Arab merchants, Christian merchants, and Jewish merchants cooperated with each other in a manner which is something which is which requires explanation. Because requires explanation and also requires a particular sort of a rethinking on our part, because it is generally believed, after the coming of the Portuguese and a particular kind of a militarization of the Indian Ocean in the form of monopoly trade that Professor Ganesh was also pointing out, we think that communities, groups operating in the Indian Ocean always have this conflictual relationship with each other. That is not true. It was relatively a freer kind of a system of exchange, extending from the southern China Canton till the northern Red Sea. There were various communities which are cooperating with each other in order to keep the wheels of commerce rotating on this vast maritime space known as the Indian Ocean. The conflict or competition, in other words, became a feature of the Indian Ocean with the coming of the mercantilist trade. And before that is before 1500, 1600, it was more like a cooperation with each other. That was the hallmark of the activities. And that is why you will find that in the copper plates, the land grant that was given to the Christian merchants, known as the Tarsapalli copper plate, is the signatory of that copper plate, that is, those who are witness to this land grant, includes people of different ethnicities, including, for example, Arab merchants. So obviously, there is an element of cooperation and collaboration between these different communities. And this is not something which is unique just to Malabar. You will see that at the port site of Somnath, for example, there is an equally a land grant or a record of a purchase of land for the construction of what is written in the inscription as Masjithi, that is a mosque, masjid. And the people who are witness to this transaction of land are various kinds of people, including, for example, Hindu, a Jaina Acharya, as well as a Shaivite guru, who was witness to the transfer of this land to this person known as Nakhuda Nuruddin Firoz for the construction of a masjid at the port site, at the port of Somnath. So what I'm trying to say is that we should look at this period, that is the pre-1500 period in the Indian Ocean, as a period of cooperation among the different people of different ethnicity as well as religious persuasion. And that was necessary, because otherwise it would not have emerged as such a vibrant zone of trade and commerce. So, I mean, simple answer would be that no, it's not that we neglect the role and importance of the Christian merchants at all in the study of the Malabar coast in the pre-15th century, definitely. I hope I've answered your question.
One more question. How did these diverse Christian communities perceive and conceive the Indian Ocean?
Okay. Oh, this perception. See, if you have listened to my presentation carefully, this is one thing that I'm trying to sort of think about. About the trade, about the trading community, about the monetary situation, about exchanges, about commodities. I have thought about it for a long time, and I've written my PhD and a lot of articles on this, but this is a perception of the sea or of the coast is something which is which is one of the concerns that I have in the recent times, and I've decided to share that with you, and I'm glad that you are interested in it. But it is not so easy to sort of gather this, to understand the perception of the different groups and communities, a perception that they have of the sea or that of the coast. So today what I did is that I explored through the geographical treatises as well as texts like Keralolpatti to understand what is the kind of perception of the coast or the port sites that exist in these texts. And I argued that these geographical texts give minute details of the port towns. What are the topographical features? What is the distance between one port to another port? What are the kind of commodities? Which are the ruling groups? And the reason why, because this information that ends up getting sort of compiled in these geographical treatises by Masoodi or Idrisi or Haukal is actually the information that is coming from via travelers. Travelers in a sense, traders, merchants, religious figures, and so on and so forth, which Harden and Purcell would call people of the sea, people on the sea, those who are on the sea, that traveling on the sea. And the writers, etc., who are then writing about the people of the sea. So it is a communication of a particular idea of a coastal landscape from the people who are actually traveling to the people whose lives are dependent on the sea, but who are not traveling to the far off regions. Okay, and so this is the context in which this kind of perception has emerged. That is the perception that emerges through the geographical treatises and as well as the letters of the Jewish traders known as the Geniza letters. But to give a very specific answer to your question is not easy, simply because we have not been thinking about the questions of perceptions vis-a-vis the history of the coast or the ocean for a very long time. I mentioned in the discussion about the works of Harden and Purcell that Harden and Purcell was in their very influential and mammoth survey of Mediterranean history called the Corrupting Sea, are actually scholars who have for the first time brought this question of the perception of the coastal regions and the mental frameworks of understanding the relationship between the sea and the coast to the domain of historical inquiry. Before that, it was Brodelian framework where structures matter. That is, what is the type of ship, what is the method of sailing, what are the kind of commodities, which are the different currents, what are the physical forces that are shaping up the sailing, such as the monsoon in the case of Western Indian Ocean. So we have now moved from the structures to that of what could be characterized as mentalities or frameworks or perceptions. So hopefully, I'll be able to give more specific answer to your question as I think more about this question, this issue of perception of the sea or the coastal topography.
Next question by Susan Mishra. There is rich and exhaustive work in the 8th century CE exchanges across the Indian Ocean. It is also essential to tap other sources besides Arabic and also look at other sources such as the Serja Melayu and other accounts across the ocean to have a more holistic understanding. Post 8th century CE, Islam spread across to Southeast Asia, and it is important to see developments in political arena in a wider Indian Ocean perspective. Also, is there any difference in descriptions by Arabs and the Geniza, as latter was a first-hand account?
I agree with you completely, Susan, that we should also look at the other kind of sources. No historian can ever disagree with this basic argument. The more sources we have, the better place we are in terms of making generalizations. And that is particularly true, as you have rightly pointed out, in the case of the Indian Ocean, because this is one of the zones whereby connections and connectivity, or what Sanjay Subramaniam calls a connected history, is the method of looking at or understanding a particular region in relation to ship and in connection to the other region. So I I accept with your first part of your comment that we should look at the sources of Southeast Asia also. Some historians have done it and are doing it. For example, Mahmoud Korea has been looking at circulation of these ideas of Islamic law as moving from the Malabar to that of the Southeast Asia, and also vice versa. And they'll, in the future, obviously, there will be more researchers which will look at the sources of the Southeast Asian context as well, including that of the archaeological sources. I mean, I have looked at some of the information from the secondary works that have been done by scholars on Southeast, like, for example, Anthony Reed, or John Wisdom and Christie, who have worked on the maritime polities of the Southeast Asia. But I have not looked at any primary source, and I believe you are sort of speaking about some primary source, Serja, Melayu. So I'll be sort of exploring it to and see what sort of information it has in terms of enriching our understanding of the situation of the Malabar coast. Regarding the second point, what is the difference in the description by the Arab? See, Geniza letters, you are rightly saying, are letters of, they're actually business letters of the Jewish merchants who are traveling to the Malabar coast from Red Sea and the Yemen region. They are referred in these letters as Musafirul Hind, travelers to India, which the scholar, most prominent scholar of these Geniza letters, S.D. Goetine, have sort of translated this term Musafirul Hind to as India traders. So these Jewish traders were India traders, and there are more than 450 letters of these merchants who are specifically dealing in this Red Sea, Aden, and Malabar trade network. And you're very correct to say that they are first-hand account or direct account, but more than first-hand and direct account, they are not. I mean, Ibn Battuta's account can also be treated as a first, or for example, Marco Polo, who we know historically that they have visited the coastal Malabar. But what differentiate Geniza letter from even those kind of accounts, that is of the Ibn Battuta, etc., also that they are actually the business letters of the Jewish merchants. And they were part of this documentary exchanges between two merchants. They were, and they're not like travel literature such as Ibn Battuta's account was. It was Rihla. It was a travel account, a specific genre of writing that was popular at that point of time in Arabic world. So these letters are business letters. That is why Goetine calls it business letter. So naturally, they contain the description of things which are directly relevant to the trade. As a result of which, often we get what is called the very direct information about port towns. Like, for example, let me contrast it. The kind of impression that you get it from Al-Idrisi's account about, let us say, port town of Kaulam, that is Quilon, and that of the Geniza letter would be different in a manner that Al-Idrisi's account would be telling you that what is the difference between Kaulan to Fandarina, what is the difference, how much time it will take to travel from Fandarina to, for example, Malé, or Sarandeep, that is Sri Lanka, while the Geniza letter would tell you exact information that on such and such year, such and such ship of such and such Nakhuda is traveling from Kulamali to Aden, carrying so-and-so commodity of so-and-so merchant. Okay, so this is like the two kinds of information. One information, for example, of the Al-Idrisi that we get from Al-Idrisi's account is what Abraham Udovich calls impressionistic data. You know, that it gives an impressionistic data. Or for example, Ibn Battuta saying that, you know, from Calicut, there are 40 Chinese ships that would sail every season. That is, we can't be sure that there were exactly 40. Exactly 40 Chinese ships were sailing. Though we get an impression that good number of Chinese ships were sailing from Port of Calicut to South China Sea. But here we can be precise and sure that yes, if this ship is being mentioned as being sailed, because this is a ship on which the consignment is going of that merchant. And along with that consignment, this letter is traveling. And when this consignment reaches to this merchant, another Jewish merchant in Aden, he receives the letter also. And he would not destroy the letter, because it was a practice in the medieval Judaism to not destroy any letter which would have sacred invocation. So he will store it. And later on, he deposited it in a synagogue, or in a chamber in a synagogue called Geniza, to be ritually destroyed later. And that is how we get that letter. So the fact that we get that letter is a very direct proof that so-and-so ship from so-and-so port carrying so-and-so commodity for so-and-so price has actually happened. So that is the basic difference, to say so, between the geographical treatises or Rihla and that of the Geniza letter. The kind of information. I just give you an example to give you the sort of different ways in which both category of the textual source tell us about the ports and that of the coast of Malabar.
Next question by Renu. It seems to her that while Keralpati has been examined in the context of regional state formation by historians like Veluthatu and MGS, its importance in the context of the Indian Ocean remains underexplored. Apart from the historical consciousness, the Keralpati, when read alongside other contemporary texts like Tufat, represents a maritime consciousness of the people of Malabar. She would like to have your thoughts on this.
I am trying to argue precisely this. I mean, if you think that I have managed to communicate this idea, then that, and then I believe that that whatever I said made sense, because this is what I'm trying to sort of argue. And not just this, I'm trying to take what you have said slightly a step forward by arguing that if it represents the maritime consciousness of the people of the Malabar, these narratives of creation of the Malabar through the hands of Parasuram, or that of what is there in the Tuhfatul Mujahideen about the transformation of a last era ruler to, the story is interesting. You should, those of you who have not read it can read it. That what is the exact story, how the role of the trade, merchants and ships. And interestingly, there is not only the role of the Arabic merchants in convincing or answering the queries of last chairman ruler, who, according to the Tuhfatul Mujahideen, became follower of Islam, but the first people to tell him about the development that has taken place in the far off region, that is Islam, were actually Jewish and the Christian merchants, according to the Tuhfatul Mujahideen. It is the Jewish and the Christian merchants who informed him about this, and subsequently he got in touch with the Arab merchants. So these descriptions definitely show an awareness of the people of that region, that there is a sea and there are people who are crossing and traveling the sea, and this region's history is intricately linked to the other region across the sea. But what kind of impact should it then have on the models that we have of looking at state or state formation or evolution of a regional identity, is the broader question that I'm trying to think about and I've tried to raise in this presentation. That if we accept that, yes, it is a presentation of a awareness of the sea and the importance of the sea, that is one simple conclusion. But if we accept that, what sort of ramification would it then have for the state formation? Then how are you going to look at the state then? That how is the state developing? K.N. Ganesh sir a moment ago has suggested that we should look at this way, that ideologically, though there are strong Brahmanical influence, materially it is the Indian Ocean commerce which is playing a very strong role in terms of providing or creating the material background for the rise of these states, particularly from the 11th century onwards. We know them as Swarupams and Naduvalis. So that could be one way of looking at it, that this awareness of the sea or the recognition of the crucial role of the sea is happening in mythology or in terms of representation of historical consciousness, because the wealth that is coming through the maritime connections or the resources that are coming through the maritime connections are very crucial for a transition, particular kind of transitions, including political transitions, to take place in society in these centuries.
Next question by Anas Pandey. Drawing on Elizabeth Lambourne's arguments regarding the Kutuba network, how do you think the direct linkages of Malabar port towns with the Rasulids, independent of any central authority, contributed to a distinctive image of these ports compared to the Coromandel ports?
Uh, when I was talking about the exception in the way in which the people who are recipient of the stipends from the Rasulid Sultan of Yemen has been, this information actually comes from the record of the treasury of the Rasulid Sultan. So it's basically almost like a, what you call account book, where you'll say that so-and-so person from so-and-so region has been given so-and-so annual gold coins, 40 mythicals, 40 gold coins, etc., etc. Now, in that context, I said that we see a pattern and the list is prepared. Generally, list is prepared one particular port in this particular region, and these are the people who have received payment in relation to this port and this region. And I gave you example of Kanabaya, that is Cambay, and Al Juzurat, that is Gujarat. This is how people who have received stipend, people in a sense that Qazis and Khatibs who have received payment in the Gujarat region would be under this heading in the account book of Rasulid Sultan. While in case of Malabar, we don't see any such. Rather, we see place like Bud, like Buddhafattanam, Vallarapattanam, which is identified with Vallarapattanam, about which I also talked about. Such and such person, name of the person would be given in this much of money. Similarly, Kaul, similarly, there would be Ponnani, which will be Fonani in Arabic. Similarly, there will be Pandarina, that is Pantalyani Kollam. Name of the port and person, rather than one port, one region, and name of the several people. This Lambourne says that, similarly, in the case of eastern coast, that is the Malabar, you don't have that kind of pattern. You have another pattern whereby simply the name of the Malabar and the king is, name of the ruler is mentioned, that is the Cholas. Name of the Cholas are mentioned. Now, these two are exceptions. One is Malabar, another in the case of Malabar, that is the Coromandel. In the case of Malabar, I made this point that even the Arabic authors also do not give very minute and detailed description of the port towns of Coromandel coast, and they rather simply say that the ruler are Sundarbandi. Generally, they refer to the Pandyas and the Cholas as the people who are concerned about this coast, and they don't talk about individual ports or rulers who would be in the control of individual ports. So how would you explain this? Why there is this difference? In the case of Malabar, omission of any ruler or region, but rather a specific reference to the port and people who are associated with that port getting the stipend. And in the case of Coromandel, just the name of the ruler and not any specific information. In fact, in the case of Malabar, there are not many recipients of the grant also. So Coromandel coast was generally not the area where Rasulids were much interested, simply probably because there was not very strong diasporic Islamic Muslim community on the Malabar, on the Coromandel coast. Hence, the presence of the Qadis and the Khatibs also would be numerous, as a result of which the entire purpose of getting the khutbah read in their name would also not exist, because it was explicitly a political purpose. But in the case of the omission in Malabar, Lambourne suggests that the omission probably is because in the eyes of the Rasulid Sultans, this is each and every port was distinctive. And rather they directly dealt with Yemen rather than Rasulids recognizing them under one centralized power or authority. That might be the reason. And if we think like that, then around this period, when the Khutbah network, this document is of 1290, but it could actually also contain information from earlier period. But Lambert would say that it is in the 13th and the 14th century that we see this network. This is pretty much the time when there is no centralized authority in the Kerala. Kerala state has already declined in the first half of the 12th century, and in its place you have numerous polities, which are known as by the terms such as Swarupams and Naduvalis. And for these Swarupams and Naduvalis, control of a particular port under their domain was of a crucial significance. So that suggestion of the Lambert makes sense or can be accepted because you have that kind of political structure in Malabar in these centuries, where these ports virtually were, some of these prominent ports were virtually under the control of different ruling houses or groups, which were independently existing and dealing with the different regions of Indian Ocean world. Hence the perception of, hence this individual ports being mentioned rather than them being mentioned under one heading with regard to the Malabar port. I think I've answered your question. What was the another part? Independence and the control distinctives. Yeah. So I believe I have answered your question. If there is anything further, you can ask.
Professor Dineshan, do you like to add anything in this regard?
That if anybody else who is attending the webinar is interested in asking question directly, please use the raise hand option. Thank you very much, Digvijay Singh, for a wonderful presentation. It was really, really interesting. Since it's too late, I'll ask, or I will make a suggestion. Not a suggestion. I will make a comment rather. That's regarding the formation of state or formation of region. What I felt is that when you say that there is an interrelationship between the Indian Ocean thing and the emergence of state or kind of a political order in between 18th and 15th century in the Malabar coast, what I felt is that you are into a kind of evolutionary argument. Like pre-18th century, there was chieftain-based society, and post-18th century, there is emerging a state, and with all kinds of juridical, and that state itself has a kind of juridical political model or something like that. So this is the major way in which political structures have been discussed in Kerala history. What I felt is that if you're looking deeply into the structures of political order and political authority from 18th century to the 15th century, you would see that that is not actually kind of state. It's not that they were not aware of state. Rather, what is emerged is not the kind of state which we normally imagine. MGS, of course, earlier he said that this is the period of state formation, but later he said it's a kind of Brahminical oligarchy or something like that. If you are looking into the political structures from 12th century to 15th century, what we are seeing is kind of Swarupams, where Swarupams doesn't have, I think, doesn't have the structure of a state. Rather, it is a kind of Mupu Varsha or something like that. If in that situation, when we say that there is a state formation or a kind of regional formation, whatever may be that, it needs some kind of rethinking about the idea of the state itself. That's what I felt after listening to your presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. I think this is a very, very important sort of a suggestion. I mean, the whole thinking about the idea of the state, particularly pre-modern state, is one of the big, I would say, historiographical questions that we have in front of us, irrespective of regions. I mean, irrespective of coastal region or Malabar or any other region, it requires a lot of thinking, because I completely agree with you that pre-received notions that we have of the states and states which have emerged in the early centuries of the before common era till the 16th and 17th and 18th century were identical is obviously historically unsustainable kind of idea. So what do we mean when we use the word state in different period and different region is something that needs to be defined in every context. We can't take it for granted that, you use a label of state to refer to the cheras of the Mahodayapuram, and you also use the label of the state to refer to the cheras that are mentioned in the Sangam text, for example. And they cannot both be characterized in a similar manner because the evidence that we have of their presence or the markers, material manifestations of their existence are very different. So this is a point well taken. And one of the ways in which I'm trying to look at, I mean, if I don't use the word state and I use the word polity, to look at the polity or political processes that are happening in this region, is to simply think how to fit in the coast into the equation. That would be one of the things that I have in my mind. That whatever political structure that we see emerging between 8th to 15th century, how do we fit into the coastal region or the coast and the coasts association with the Indian Ocean into the picture? That is something that I'm thinking. But thank you very much for your suggestion of not taking state as a well-defined and clearly explained notion or a concept, rather than problematize it and try to understand its specific meaning in specific context. Thank you, sir.
Now it's the time to wind up the session.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Professor K. N. Ganesh, for chairing the session. Thank you, Dr. Dinesh Vadakinil, for being with us. Thank you, Dr. Digvijay Singh, for being part of our webinar. Thank you for the participants for actively taking part in the program. And finally, thank you for the entire KCHR team for supporting me during the coordination of the event. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to the KCHR, the present director of the KCHR, the chairman, you, academic director, and everybody else who joined us today for giving me this opportunity. KCHR has been part of my journey, as I said in the beginning itself, for last many, many years. And I'm really thankful for this opportunity, and also thankful to the KCHR for sort of giving me the fellowship, which sustained some of the research that I undertook and which I shared with you today. So thank you so much.
Thank you.